hopefully we'll get through section 2 and 3. If you remember from last week, let's do a little review. The reason that Obadiah wrote this prophecy is because of Edom. Edom, they are the descendants of Esau. Israel, Judah, they're the descendants of Jacob. And because of the conflict between the two brothers, it's continued through the generation. And so the countries are not really at war. They just don't like each other. Although Judah, they're not really aggressive, but Edom is. And Edom, and we're going to see this in this section 9. Edom's, the problem God has with them is not necessarily that they're violent and evil. He calls it violence, but it's not physical violence. It's violence in other ways. And so God issues a prophecy, an edict to Edom. And the problem is going to be because of their pride, they're going to be in trouble. So if you look at verse 10, verse 10. Oh, actually, let me read verse 1 because each one of these sections starts the same way. Look at verse 1. The vision of Obadiah, thus says Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, let us go against her for battle. That verse summarizes verses 2 through 9. So the way these sections open up is there is a verse that summarizes what's to follow. So verses 1 through 9 is a section. That's the first section of Obadiah. And so it starts off with verse 1 with the prophet saying, this is what I'm going to talk about. You know, because of what you've been doing, an envoy has been sent, and it's saying, let us go to battle. In other words, the problem that I want to discuss first is your animosity toward Judah. Verse 10 is going to do the same thing for verses 11 through 14. Verses 11 through 14 is the second section. And verse 10 is a summary of the next section. So look at verse 10. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you'll be covered with shame and you'll be cut off forever. So in the first verse, he says, this is what I want to talk about first. You know, you guys have this lofty attitude about yourself. Remember, he said, you take a lot of pride in yourself because you build, homes up in the cliff. You try to like emulate eagles, like you're untouchable and invincible, but I'll bring you down, God says. And so now in verse 10, he said, okay, now the second part of this is why I'm going to do that. Why do I want to bring you down? Why is it that you guys are going to have to be judged? In verse 10, he summarized it because of violence to your brother. Now he's talking about Esau and Jacob, two literal brothers, but in this sense, he's expanding that. He's talking about the nation. I think the reason he uses the names Esau and Jacob is because it makes it more dramatic. Because it shows us where all this comes from. You know, what the root of all this is. This extends back generation. And so it just kind of puts an exclamation mark on it. So he says in verse 10, because verses 1 through 9, I'm going to judge you. You guys have pride. It's your pride that gets you. And we're going to look at really two different causes. In other words, why does God judge Edom? Cause number 1, because of their pride. That's verses 1 through 9. Because you guys are prideful. You think nobody can touch you. You're invincible, but I'll bring you down. Cause number 2, because of your violence against Judah. That's verses 11 through 14. And so now we're looking at why this prophecy had to be. Why God has to judge the Edomites. And if you just look at verse 10, pride's not the only reason that God is going to humble Edom. They had violated God's people. And by violated, they were violent towards them. But it's not physical violence, and he's going to explain that. Violence, and you're going to recognize the word for this. In Hebrew, the word violence is Hamas. That's the word for violence. And violence in this particular context, it includes more than moral and physical brutality. It extends beyond just what we would think of as physical violence. It's a it's an attitude thing, and it makes it more despicable because look at verse 10. It's against your brother. These people are descended from brothers. These are your brothers. These are your kinfolk. And so the Israelites, and so your attitude towards them brings greater shame. And so the greater shame comes in the fact that you are mistreating your brother. So that's why I think he's using the name Jacob. It just makes it makes it more striking. In other words. So now look at the charges in verse 11. Now he's going to get specific and he's going to explain the charges in verses 11 through 14. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune, and do not rejoice over these sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. Verse 14, do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. So he's going to outline this second cause. The first cause of judgment is pride. The second cause is violence against Judah, the Israelite. And verse 11, he gives us one example. It's the first example, and it's all about Edom's violence against her brother. But again, look at verse 11. On the day you stood aloof, on the day strangers carried off their wealth. He's referring to a particular day. He's got a day in mind. He's thinking of it'd be for us like saying on the day that America got its independence, and we would all know that's July 4th, 1776. That's when we got our independence. Well, he's referring to a day, although he don't tell us the day, and so we can speculate based on the contextual evidence in the passage, but he doesn't tell us. He doesn't say I'm referring to this. I have my opinion on it. But we don't know. Now, let me say this. Day in this context, it does not always refer to a period of 12 or 24 hours. We're not talking about just one day. We're not talking about just, or maybe not talking about just one 24-hour period. In the Bible, when you say a day, it can refer to a longer period of time. But it encompasses like a time period, like the day of Noah's Ark, or something like that. So we don't know what exactly he's referring to, but he's referring to an event. And so in verses 1 through 9, he said, you guys have a lot of pride, and so I'm going to have to bring you down because of your pride. In verses 11 through 14, he said, you guys have been mistreating Israel, and here's one of it. Look at verse 11. On the day that you stood aloof, in other words, you didn't help. On the day that you just stood back and watched. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth, Israel's wealth, and foreigners entered his gate. In other words, here's God's reason number 2. In the day of their great need, Israel's great need, Edom didn't help. And they're, for lack of a better word, they're spiritual brothers. I mean, they come from Esau and Jacob. And so God said, you guys stood back and watched as strangers entered their gate and carried them off. Anytime, if you remember, when you talk about the Old Testament, anytime it says gate of the city, that's City Hall. That's the way they refer to it. So it's, and I've told you this before, the best example of that is Lot in Genesis. If you read the story of Lot and Abraham, they both had great flocks, and God said, you pick the land you want because we can't do this together anymore. And Lot, with his physical eyes, chose a spot close to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abram went off. And Abram went to a place that was less desirable from a physical standpoint, but it was God's place. And so if you read the Genesis account, Lot's over here in a field somewhere, and Sodom's down at the bottom of a mountain. And the next time you read about Lot, he's at the edge of the cliff, and he's looking at the city. I mean, he's checking it out. The next time you read about Lot, he's down the cliff. He's moving closer and closer. So he's actually within physical proximity of Sodom and Gomorrah. The next time you read about Lot, it says Lot is sitting at the gate of Sodom, which means, by context of Old Testament history, he's a city official by that time. So he's the foreigner to Sodom. He moves closer and closer because it's appealing. It's a big city, got lots of stuff going on, a lot of bad stuff, but it's got a lot of stuff going on. And next thing you know, he's a city official of Sodom. And so anytime you refer to gate in the Old Testament, it's the city hall. It's the seat of government. That's where the court intervenes. That's where the political people meet. And so look at verse 11. On the day that strangers entered their gate. Anytime you say strangers entered the gate in the Old Testament, that means your city fell. That means that your seat of government has been toppled and you've been taken over. That's what that phrase means. So what God is saying through Obadiah is, on the day that strangers invaded Judah and took them over, you guys just sit back and watch. You stood aloof and you didn't help. So instead of helping your brother, you just watch the enemy take over. Now, again, that can mean a lot of things. I think it's referring to 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar came into Judah and took away the temple treasures and the people, especially the young people. It's when Daniel got snatched away, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is the greatest of the foreign invasions of Judah, and I think this is what Obadiah is referring to through God's word. So they watched. Now it's not just they watched, but look at keep reading verse 11. And they cast lots for Jerusalem, the capital city. You too were as one of them. In other words, you were just as guilty because you didn't help. Guilt by association. You watched, and so you're just as guilty. Now look at verse 12, because not only did they watch, look at verse 12. Do not gloat. So they took joy in it. They gloated over it. They had glee over it. So they're sitting back watching. From my understanding, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians enter into Jerusalem, fell the capital, steal all the kids, take away all the wealth, and Edom sat and watched and didn't offer a finger to help, and instead sit back and laughed about it and took great joy in it. And so God says in verses 11 and 12, specifically verse 11, God says, I consider you, the Edomites, just as guilty as the foreign invader. You're just as guilty of it because you failed to help your brethren. Now, go back to verse 12. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Look at verse 13. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you. Do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. So God now reinforces the seriousness of it. He's already told them what they're being judged for. Number one is pride. Number two is violence against Judah. And he said in verse 11, you stood back, you watched them get invaded, and you took joy over it. And so now he's going to reinforce that. Why that's bad, why he's mad. As a matter of fact, from verses 12 to 14, did you notice that I read the same phrase over and over again? 8 times in those verses. 8 times God reinforces that you guys in some way delighted over them in the day of their distress. 8 times God reinforces that. And it's the same as in, if you go back to verse 7, there's a lot of like parallelism in Obadiah where he uses the same structure and over. This is one of them. It's just like in verse 7, there's a threefold iteration of their pride. In this case, there's an 8-fold iteration of their their disregard, their aloofness. So 8 times God said, this is what you guys are doing. As a matter of fact, there's a pun here. Look at the words starting in verse 12. The day of their destruction, their distress, their disaster, their disaster. Verse 13, their disaster. He keeps saying disaster and distress, same word. You know what it is? Edom, E-D-A-M. It's a pun, because he's talking about the country of Edom, E-D-O-M, and this is in their distress, E-D-A-M. And so he's saying, Edom, you didn't care about their Edom. You know, it's kind of a pun. 8 times God says it because it sounds like their name. And so 8 times God is reinforcing, you people did these things. And I don't like it. Now, look at the words that it uses. Gloat, rejoice, boast. Those are not physical violence. That's not taking up arms and going in there and taking over the city. It's more than physical. And so what God is saying is, Edom's greatest sins, the way he measures them on this occasion, is attitude. It's their attitude. It's not that they went in with clubs and spears and all this. It's their attitude. And this is where it's going to get kind of poetic, because they're supposed to be helping Judah, and they're watching them getting occupied and taken over. And in verse 7, God says, those allies that you put a lot of stock in, they're going to turn on you. The same thing you're doing to Judah is going to happen to you. You know, turnabout's fair play kind of thing. So in verses 12 and 13, he's giving us more information about what the problem is. They've got a hostile attitude toward their brothers. And again, it's more than physical, because God, even from early on, God cares more about the heart attitude than he does the outer stuff that we do. The external, the actions, you know, whether they're negative or positive. I mean, God doesn't like the negative, obviously, and God likes the positive. But God cares more about the heart. God cares more about why you're doing good than just the fact you're doing good. You know, why do you come to church? You know, why do you witness to your neighbor? Why do you do these things? Are you trying to make a name for yourself, or are you trying to fill out some scorecard in heaven? Or do you genuinely care about people? And do you genuinely care about worship? And then on the other hand, why are you being ugly? You know, why are you holding a grudge? Why are you snapping at people the way you snap? Because whatever's going on externally reveals something that's going on internally. Because whatever's going on internally manifests itself outward. And so if I'm hateful to somebody and ugly to somebody and snap on somebody, there's usually a spiritual component to that. There's a reason why I'm doing that. You know, I'm not that mad at the girl at the drive-through that forgets to put my fries in the bag. In the grand scheme of things, missing fries is not that big of a deal. But if I smart off that little teenager just because they forget to put a sack of $2 fries in a bag, there's something going on inside me that's causing me to snap like that. Because ordinarily, that shouldn't bother me the way it bothers, you see. And so in verses 12 through 13, God is saying, it's these hostile attitudes, that's why I have a problem. Because you shouldn't be acting like this. So now look at verse 14. Because we're not going to rule out the physical. Do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. So physical violence eventually does happen. So the hostile attitudes eventually manifest into some kind of physical. And look what happens. And this is sick. This is really sick. Look at verse 14 again. Or set the context for this. What has happened? What is Obadiah referring to? The Judahites, they're living in Jerusalem and in Judah peacefully, surrounded by neighbors, peaceful. In 586 BC, Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, he's fighting a war with King Necho of Egypt. Both of them die. Nebuchadnezzar hears that his daddy's dead. He's away, and he's got to get back to Babylon. And so to get back to Babylon, he has to cross through Judah. And as he goes through Judah, his army ransacks Jerusalem. And they start burning stuff to the ground. They start kidnapping teenagers. And the ones who don't get kidnapped, what do? What do you do in a war? You flee. You have refugees. You have people from Jerusalem say, we got to get out. You know, the Babylonians here, they're killing people. They're taking people captive. So they leave. Look at what Edom does in verse 14. They stand at the fork of the road, and when the fugitives flee, they're killing them. So this evil attitude, like, you know, y'all getting y'all's, you know, it's about time Israel's getting there. You know, look at us. We're high and mighty. We've got these houses in these cliffs. Nobody can touch us. We're invincible. We're above everybody else. And then they see this invasion going on, and they start gloating over it, mocking it. And then all of a sudden they're looking from their houses up high, and all these Judahites are running for their life. So instead of giving them refuge, or instead of just staying back and watching, they start shooting arrows at them, and they start attacking them from on high, and they start killing all these refugees. And so God says, the first thing is your pride got way out of hand, and secondly, you developed this unwarranted hostility toward Jerusalem and toward Judah. Started with an attitude, but it didn't end there. It ended with some physical violence. And so God said, that's reason number 2 why I'm bringing you down. Because you guys don't deserve to stay like this. Now, there's a lot of commentators that say verse 14 is hyperbole, that it doesn't mean they're actually killing them. There's nothing in the text that suggests that. Everything in the text suggests that they are actually murdering refugees. That's what it says. You know, there's nothing in there contextually that says this is just a figure of speech or something. So they're killing these people. Look at verse 14 again. And do not imprison their survivors in the day of the distress. Now again, there's 2 different time periods this could be referring to. Really, there's about 12. But there's 2 major ones. One is there's a coalition of Arabs and Philistines that went in Jehoram's reign, but it wasn't near as big as 586. In 586 is when Nebuchadnezzar went in. I think that's what he's referring to, because it was a pretty big invasion. So this is, and here's what I like about these prophecies. They don't leave us with the negative. And right now, if you cut it off at verse 14, it's all negative. It's all, Edom is prideful, and Jerusalem got attacked and destroyed. And as a matter of fact, at this same time period is when Ezekiel was a prophet, it's when Jeremiah was a prophet, it's when Daniel was taken into the palace. And so God had prophets all over the place. Obadiah's mission was not to prophesy to God's people, but to Edom, and tell the Edomites that they're coming down. So the first 14 verses is negative. It's Edom's prideful. They were hostile to Israel, and it ends. But then it picks up in verse 15, because 15 is the 3rd section. And look at, let me read to the end of the chapter. For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they never existed. But on Mount Zion, that's God's mountain. That's in contrast to Mount Seir, where the Edomites live. But on Mount Zion, there will be those who escape, and it will be holy. and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble. And they will set them on fire and consume them. So there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, also possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria. And Benjamin will possess Gilead, and the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. And the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the cities of the Negev. That's the desert in that area. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. Now there's two things going on here. There's a realization of this in Obadiah's time, and there's also an eschatological thing. It's future for us, because this is the way I'd say 99% of the prophetic books ends. It ends with hope of Israel's restoration. It's not just that there's going to be destruction of Edom and that Israel got invaded. It ends with Israel will be restored. There's a restoration of Israel. And part of that restoration is the judgment of other nations. Look at verses 15 through 18. Verse 15, the day of the Lord, it's just like verse 8. It's a future day when God will restore reverse, I should say, the fortunes of Israel. It's a day in the future when things will reverse, not only for Israel but other nations as well. It's going to flip flop. The day of the Lord, it's a common term by writing prophets. They use it a lot, and anytime you see day of the Lord, here's what it means. It means any time period that God is going to intervene in the affairs of man. That's what the day of the Lord means. It can be present, it can be past. For most of these prophecies, it's future. It's what we call eschatological, the eschaton, the end times, the end days. And so Obadiah said that there will be a day when God established his rule in human affairs. That's what he says in verses 15 through 18. In other words, there's going to be a day when Israel is restored. There's going to be a day when all these other nations get their comeuppance and they get judged, and Israel will be restored. That's eschatological. That refers to the millennial kingdom when Jesus is going to reign in Jerusalem. That's what he's referred to. That's the ultimate restoration of Israel. That's what the eschaton's about. That's what the future is about. God dealt with Israel. We're watching that. In that Chosen. God deals with Israel, and He sent Jesus, and Jesus went to the Jews, and the disciples said, "Can we go to the Gentiles?" He said, "Not yet. This is for my people right now." And eventually, the Jews are going to reject Him and crucify Him. And so, in the grand scheme of history, God for all the Old Testament prophesied that the Messiah was going to come and He was going to rule the world. He's going to change things. And He came, and the Jews rejected, and He got crucified. And so the best way I can describe this is like God in this great timeline, God puts a slash in the timeline and takes the Jews almost like he takes them with His hands, just lifts them up and sets them aside temporarily, right? And then that line, it branches off, and when the line branches off, there's a church age that's grafted into that line. The Old Testament prophets can't see the church age. For all they knew, the Messiah was going to come, and then the end times was going to happen right after that. All these 2,000 some odd years of church history, they didn't see that. They didn't understand that. But the Jewish people are set aside, and now we're on this branch, this grafting in, and God's dealing with Gentile people. And according to the Bible, when the last Gentile comes to Christ, we don't know who that is. We don't know when that is. God does. And so we're evangelizing. We're trying to win people to Jesus. And when the last one accepts Christ, that line stops. And God says to Jesus, that's it. It's over. Now go get that church age and bring them to me. And that's when Thessalonians says, dead in Christ will rise first. Those of us who are alive and will reign will go up. And then there's going to be 7 years tribulation, because the church age, this age ends, it stops. And then there's going to be 7 years of tribulation. During the 7 years of tribulation, me and you are going to be standing before the bema seat of Christ, the judgment seat. That's going to be 7 years, what we'll do. And at that time, it's almost, and metaphorically, God takes the Jewish people and sets them back in the timeline. And then he really evangelizes them for 7 more years. He sends witnesses, and they get killed in the street, and they get resurrected, and the whole world watches, and all these false prophets come. The Antichrist is here. The false prophets here. They're manipulating faith. They're doing all these crazy things. And then after 7 years, Jesus comes back when what we call the parousia, the second coming of Christ, and he establishes a millennial kingdom. At that particular time, all the believers, Jewish and Gentiles, are restored. Everything's made new. New heaven, new earth, new Jerusalem, everything's made new. That's what he's talking about in Obadiah. When he says that the day of the Lord is going to come and God is going to establish his reign, that's what he's referring to. He's not referring to something in 400 BC or something in Jesus' time or something in 2026. He's talking about the eschaton. He's talking about the millennial kingdom. And so he says at that time, Israel will be restored. All their fortunes will be reversed. And some of them will believe, some of them will not. But look at what's going to happen to the rest of them. Look at verse 16. All the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. They'll cease to exist. So Edom's punishment, as well as all these other countries, is going to be a demise of a nation. Their nation ceased to exist. Now Edom's already happened. Edom, there's no more Edomites. They turned into Idumeans, and most of them are gone. But there's no more Edom. But in the end, they'll all be gone. And here's one of these figures of speech. When he talks about Edom, it's a figure of speech in which he's describing all ungodly nation. He's just lumping them under the Edom name. So when he says Edom, he's not talking about specifically Edom. He's talking about all countries that are anti-God, that are not with God. Now, again, here's the thing they had problem with. All prophets, every one of them. I mean, to a man, every one of them, all prophets. They had difficulty seeing future events in the way they related to each other. And Peter tells us that in 1 Peter chapter 1. They couldn't make them fit together. It didn't pan out for them. In particular, the church age. They never, ever, ever envisioned a time when God would extend mercy to Gentiles. They just didn't see that. That's why the disciples had a problem with it. And the disciples kept saying, you really want us to go to those Gentiles? Peter especially had a problem with it. They just couldn't see that. And so when these pure Jews from the 8th century BC, when they're prophesying these future things, Spring Creek Baptist Church never crossed their mind. They never thought that a bunch of Gentile believers would be sitting in a church in 2026 worshiping Yahweh. They never thought, they thought we were a bunch of pagans and we'd be here worshiping 3,000 or 4,000 different gods. They never saw us grafted into their group. That's what the book of Ephesians is about, by the way. We went over that a couple months ago. If you go back and read Ephesians, the whole book of Ephesians about the Jews and the Gentiles in the church couldn't get along. because the Gentiles thought they were now special, and the Jews thought they'd always been special, and neither one of them wanted the other one in. And so Paul had to say, there's no more Jew, there's no more Gentile. We're all Christian. We're all the same now, because they couldn't get over that. So now jump down to verse 16. Because just as you drank, all the nations will drink. They'll drink, swallow, becomes they have never existed. And all this kind of plays in the fact that Edom didn't help their brother. They stood by and watched and laughed. It's in Luke chapter 21 talks about the times of the Gentile, it's about that during the times of the Gentiles, Israel will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. Now Obadiah is describing Israel's enemies as drinking continually in the celebration of Israel's demise or their defeat. So that's what he means in verse 16. You guys are drinking continually. You're celebrating because Judah's been defeated. And that's going to be reversed, and you're going to pay for that. Look at verse 17. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and they'll be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possession. Again, future of Israel. This is restoration. It's restoration language. So look how you contrast this. You guys are going to cease to exist, and on the contrary, Israel on Mount Zion will be fine. They'll escape. They'll be restored. And so you guys are sitting here drinking and celebrating because Israel just lost to Nebuchadnezzar. But in the future, you guys will cease to exist, and Israel's going to be fine. The Jewish people are going to be okay. Get verse 18. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble. And they will set them on fire and consume them, so there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Israelites are going to consume the Edomites, he says, like a fire burns up straw. That's what he said. You guys will be gone. Yeah, again, fire is used a lot as divine judgment in Scripture. And he said, that's what's going to happen to you. Remember, this message is for Edom. It's not for Israel, it's for Edom. God is sending this message to them. This is what's going to happen to you. The house of Jacob, in contrast to the house of Joseph, refers to the southern kingdom of Judah. And it's going to be the ultimate fulfillment for Jews, which is in the second coming of Christ. So anytime one of these prophets talks about ultimate fulfillment or final judgment, they're talking eschatology. They're talking about future, for us future, something in the future, when the millennium happens, and God's people will be ultimately vindicated. And then look at verse 19 through 21. This is the last pericope of Scripture in Obadiah. Then those of the Negeb will possess the mountains of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, and then he goes on down. And in verse 19, then refers to the day of the Lord. That's what that then refers to. So on the day of the Lord, this will happen. Obadiah predicted that in that coming day, in the day of the Lord, the Jews would be living in various parts of Judah. They would be scattered. We call it a diaspora, a scattering of Jews. They migrated all over the place. They're not in Israel anymore. They spread out. And this is what he predicted. And look at his prediction that those Jews would be scattered, and they would inherit the land of all these pagan nations, the Philistines, the Sumerians, the Canaanites. Those Jews that are scattered because they got invaded, they're gonna move off eventually, and they're gonna settle in all these foreign lands. And as they settle in these foreign lands, you guys are going to start losing your land, and they'll start gaining the possession. Incidentally, those that move off and live off, those are what we're going to eventually call Hellenistic Jews in the New Testament. That's where Stephen and Paul, that's where they came from. They're Jews that didn't live in Jerusalem. They got scattered out in the diaspora during the invasion, and their families settled in all these other places, and they grew up there. And most of them's never been to Jerusalem. Never been to Judah. And they're living out. They're Hellenistic Jews. They're Greek Jews. They speak Greek. They have Greek culture, all that, but they're Jewish people. And the Hebraic Jews, those that live in Jerusalem, they look down on them. So everybody's looking down on everybody else. It's like y'all can't be as good as us. And God has to even the playing field on that. But in verses 19 through 21, God says, okay, here's what's going to happen. Those Jews right now, you're trying to kill them as they flee and all that. But one of these days, they're going to scatter and they're going to inherit your land. And you guys will cease to exist. And then ultimately, in the very end, there's going to be a new movement that happens. And all those Jews that live outside of Jerusalem in Israel, they're going to come back. We call that Zionism. The Jews go back. It started heavily in the early part of the 20th century. And in 1948, there were so many Jews back in Israel that they petitioned the United Nations to be a state. They said, we want to be Israel. We want to be our own state. And we're the only country that supported it. We're the only one that backed them. And we gave them, because of the U.S. backing, a United Nations mandate to be a country in 1948. So all these Jews that scattered out, they started moving back. And they started moving back. They started coming back. And Israel became a Jewish state again. Incidentally, that's why they're fighting over there. Because when all the Jews got scattered out, the Arabs moved in. The Arabs said, it's our land. The Jews said, no, it's our land. We've been here from the very beginning. And then when they moved in, all the Arabs got squeezed out. And when I was in Israel, right on the outskirts of Jerusalem, you see all these Palestinian tents, and they're moving closer and closer to the border of Jerusalem. And the Jews don't like it. And the Jews are trying to get them to move back. And the Palestinians are trying to get closer, because the Palestinians are saying, that was ours. We had that. And the Jews said, no, we had it first. And you guys ran us out, and now we're coming back. And so there's a big squabble. We've been fighting for 4,000 years. It's not going to end. If anybody's saying, when's all that stuff going to end? When Jesus comes back, not before. It's going to continue. And all this stuff, we don't want to get political, but all this stuff about like two-state solutions, let's give the Palestinians some Jews some, that's not biblical. That's Israeli land, just hang with them, be tough, that's theirs. But this is why Obadiah said, he's predicting all this stuff. And it all starts because Edom was ugly. They just didn't defend their brother. And they took delight in the fact that Jerusalem got overtaken by the Babylonians, and then they started killing all these people that fled. And God said, okay, Obadiah, tell them this. Tell them that this is going to be short-lived. That this hostile attitude, this nasty attitude, it's going to come back to get them, because in the end, they're going to cease to exist, and my people are going to inherit their land, and then ultimately, eschatologically, in the end time, the Jews are going to be fully restored. That's the message of Obadiah. And again, there's a lot in 21 verses. That's just 21 verses, but that's what it says. Now, I will say this. I'm a premillennial. I believe that there is a return of Christ before the millennial reign. I'm a millennialist. People that don't believe in a millennium, they think we're actually living in it now. They don't believe that Christ will reign on earth. They don't think that's literal. They think that Christ now is reigning spiritually, and we are in the millennial kingdom. And they think, and one of the main reasons I'm a premillennialist and a dispensationalist, is these people think that the modern day church has replaced Israel, that Israel has ceased to exist, and now we have the church. They call that replacement theology. That's not biblical. Research it. That's not. The church didn't replace Israel. They're two different things. God deals with Israel one way, he deals with church another way. And in the end, Israel's going to be restored, and the church will be raptured. So that's why I couldn't be an amillennialist. You know, they talk about, well, we're living in that millennial reign now. Christ rules now. He does, you know. And from a premillennial point, we call that realized eschatology. He does reign now spiritually. Christ is king. He is Lord. But eventually he's going to come back and set up an earthly kingdom. So that's a big difference. So if somebody ever questions you on that, that's